Today on Jay Sekulow Live, the Palestinians respond to historic Middle East peace with rocket attacks on the state of Israel. We'll talk about that and more on Jay Sekulow Live.
Live from Washington, D.C., Jay Sekulow Live.
Right as that ceremony was taking place at the White House yesterday, the normalization deal between Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE, Palestinian militants inside Gaza fired 2 rockets towards the Israeli town of Ashdod, where we are today. One of them intercepted by Israel's missile defense system, the Iron Dome. The other one landing here in Ashdod, injuring 6 people.
Phone lines are open for your questions right now. Call 1-800-684-3110.
The Israelis responded then with airstrikes inside the Gaza Strip overnight, at which point militants fired more rockets, 13 in total, from a second round into southern Israel. There were no injuries reported from that second round, but tension does remain high as Hamas, the group in control of Gaza, tells Fox News that there will be no peace or stability until the needs of the Palestinians are met.
And now, your host, Jordan Sekulow.
So that is how the Palestinian militant groups responded to historic peace deals announced yesterday between Israel and Bahrain, Israel and the UAE, and the President of the United States saying last night on ABC, not 5, but additional 9 countries from the Muslim world. And when we say the Muslim world, not all in the Gulf states, but countries in North Africa have been discussed. Remember, we talked about countries even from the former Soviet blocs like Kosovo, recognizing Israel for the first time in their history, a predominantly Muslim former Soviet bloc country, in their economic deal that they made with Serbia, which was historic as well a couple of weeks ago. So what is the response from Palestinians? Well, 13 rockets fired at Israel. 2 people were injured in Israel. The Iron Dome intercepted 8 of those missiles. Then the IDF responded with 2 waves of airstrikes. I guarantee you a lot more damage was done on the Gaza Strip, which is typical of the Palestinians to what they do. These groups do is you launch 13 rockets at Israel. Minor damage is done. 2 people injured is not nothing. And of course, that means something. But most of those rockets get intercepted, and then you get a wave of airstrikes on your people. That's what comes back at you. And this is how the Palestinian leadership, Andy, has decided to respond to the Gulf states beginning to line up, and even more reports that Saudi Arabia is very much considering, this recognition of Israel officially and establishing formal diplomatic ties. There would be no one left to fund the Palestinians except for some Iranian money to Hamas, and even that gets complicated.
Right. This is a reprehensible response to a historic peace deal that has been brokered by President Trump, and I think that's very important that we recognize that it is through the impetus and through the work that has been done by Donald Trump, the art of the dealer extraordinaire, who has put together the Israelis, the Bahrainis, and those in the United Arab Emirates. And to have as a response to that rocket attacks from the Gaza Strip into peaceful Israeli territory is a reprehensible act of cowardice on the part of the Palestinians. And the Israelis responded in kind, as they should have done to protect themselves. The IDF is there to protect. It is not an offensive force. It is a defensive force for a reason. But I think that the fact that the overtures for peace, the opening of peace negotiations, was met with nothing but violence on the part of Palestinians is a reprehensible show of display of evil, really, on the part of the leadership of the Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere.
And what you have to also imagine is this the end of that boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that we've been fighting so aggressively here in the United States and across the world, when you have these major Islamic powers, states, nations, saying they want to work cooperatively economically with Israel. So they're not going to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So who's going to be funding those groups anymore? I'll ask Dan Bennett. We'll talk about that as well, because it's basically down to a couple of groups at the United Nations. Where's that funding even going to be coming from? You think a lot of this is going to be drying up for Hamas. A lot of this is going to be drying up for those anti-Israel, whether they were militant groups or militant movements like boycott, divestment, sanction of Israel. We'll be taking your calls too, 1-800-684-3110. That's 1-800-684-3110. We're going to get into politics as well. Where do you think this race stands? If the election were held today, who would win? I want your thoughts on it. Welcome back to Jay Sekulow Live. This is Jordan Sekulow. We're taking your phone calls, 1-800-684-3110, because we spent yesterday's broadcast on those historic peace deals that were signed at the White House yesterday, the trilateral deal between Bahrain, the UAE, and Israel, and then the bilateral deals between Israel and Bahrain and Israel and the UAE. The flights are allowed to fly over Saudi Arabia. For the first time, Saudi Arabia has given blanket authority for Israeli commercial aircraft to fly over Saudi airspace, which you have to do to fly to the UAE and to be quick flights to Bahrain. And those flights were already starting to happen because these deals were already starting to go into effect. Yesterday, they were formalized. And how did the Palestinians respond? Did they respond thinking, oh, this is going to help us move towards peace because Israel is going to have some pressure points on economic cooperation with Bahrain and the UAE, and they're going to want to solve our problems. But recall that, I don't know if we have the soundbite from Jared Kushner that we just played in the break, but we'll get it for you, about everything that's already been put on the table for the Palestinians by the Trump administration in Israel that they've rejected already over these last few years. And you think about, so how did they respond? I don't know if we have the sirens to play or the rockets to play, but they responded with a barrage of 13 rockets fired at Israel that started the moment these signings were done. So the moment they were fired out of the Gaza Strip into Israel. 8 of them were, of course, intercepted by the Iron Dome. Some did hit, most in kind of no man's land, but a couple did injure people on the ground in Israel. So how did Israel respond? Well, I don't think we've seen the devastation yet in the Gaza Strip, but with 2 waves of airstrikes. Now, this is the problem with the Palestinians. One of the problems with their reactions. They fire rockets, and you start throwing rocks like that, but then you get hit with airstrikes. Now, the airstrikes are more targeted, but the damage they cause is much more significant, and not just loss of life, but to infrastructure. Typically, what Israel targets is terrorist infrastructure there, sometimes power plants, sometimes, ways to basically shut down the activities so that no more rockets are fired on their civilians. So they, of course, Hamas will target civilian areas. They kind of launch these indiscriminately at towns and cities. Israel strikes back with actual targeted attacks. And you have to ask the question now, which I think is serious. Who's left in this Palestinian movement when these countries in the Gulf are now saying our ally is Israel? Than, you talked about this yesterday at the United Nations. We talked about the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which is also has been popular on U.S. college campuses. Now that the countries that were funding this a lot of time, the crown prince that would send $1 million check to fund one of these movements, is now in a country where he's economically benefiting from a relationship with Israel. That will dry up quickly, and the politics that were played there. And you even believe that at the UN, you've taken a significant block of anti-Israel votes out of those censure votes that happened at the General Assembly.
No question about it, Jordan. I mean, I would address it on 2 levels. First, on the BDS level, it's a huge blow to the BDS effort, if not a fatal blow because of the economic interest. But then, Jordan, at the United Nations, the reason that censures at the General Assembly and even more aggressive actions at the Security Council, the reason they have traction is because the economic clout and the economic threat, really, that the Organization for the Islamic Cooperation has over these countries. Jordan, if you're in not only a peace deal, but an economic agreement with the State of Israel, are you going to go to the floor of the General Assembly and vote for a censure? I don't think so. So I think the next time one of those issues comes up at the United Nations, there's going to be a whole line of countries, and I think that list is going to grow, Jordan, who are not going to play along. They're not going to play that game. And I think back to something that Rick Grinnell told us last week, Jordan. He said, why should Americans care about this? It's because when we provide economic opportunity, it drives hope, it drives peace, and that keeps Americans safer. Jordan, I really think that's at the bottom line. The Palestinians have shown they're not a worthy peace partner, but the President of the United States has found worthy peace partners. And at the end of the day, that makes Americans safer.
I think what is important, I want you to listen to what Jared Kushner had to say on PBS. We said he went through the opportunity that Palestinians have had, but that they stand in the way of it. Bite 38.
It's a big opportunity for the Palestinians, and they have a perfect track record of blowing every opportunity they've had in their past, but perhaps maybe their leadership will read the details of it, stop posturing, and do what's best to try to make the Palestinian people's lives better.
What's interesting to me, Andy, is and what Jared Kushner says is true. They have blown every opportunity they've had in their past. He said, and literally they blow it up, if you wanted to use the right terms, whether they're sitting in suicide, homicide bombers, or they are sitting in, again, these rockets. And now they've announced that Hamas and Fatah, who hate each other and threw each other off the tops of buildings. My question is just how long, unless there's something more core with the Palestinian people, and is how long is it until they rise up and throw those leaders off the tops of buildings and say, you know what, they're offering us a state, we could have an airport, we could have sovereignty, we could be running things. This is happening, it's happened in places that were much more difficult to do that, like in Sudan, where Omar al-Bashir had much more of a stronghold than any of these Fatah leaders or Hamas leaders.
You would think that the Palestinian people would rise up and overthrow their leadership, who has consistently, as Jared Kushner said, blown every opportunity to come to terms of peace with the Israelis and with those around them. But I just don't see the Palestinian people coming and coalescing together. They're allowing this corrupt leadership that has been in power since the days of Arafat, since before then, to keep in their heart this hatred for Israel, this universal, long-standing despising of Israel. No matter what happens and what the other Arab nations do, they cannot get over that. They refuse to get over that. Their response to peace is war. Their response to overtures for economic investment, for social services, for health services, for technology advancement, for all the things that would make life good for the Palestinian people has been to reject it categorically time and time again. You would think, wouldn't you, Jordan, that the Palestinian people would finally rise up and say, we've had enough of this. The leadership can go to you-know-where. We need to come to terms, as the Israelis have with the Bahrainis, with the United Arab Emirates, with soon Saudi Arabia and other countries. But I just don't predict that happening in the short term. I just don't.
Yeah, which means they'll just be further isolated from the world and from the world stage with less allies at the UN. And there was actually an article in the New York Times, interestingly enough, about how ineffective the UN has become. This is the New York Times writing about how through all their scandals they've had economically, if you look at actually where the world is with peace, it's mostly done unilateral, bilateral moves, like by the United States handling it or other countries handling it. And the UN has played this very secondary role, and it's becoming especially with COVID, when they're not having their meetings that they're used to having in these kind of group meetings, it's becoming almost irrelevant. They say, of course, they have their peacekeeping missions. That's probably the most relevant that they have, is that they actually put troops on the ground in 13 different locales. But other than that, that their entities and all their different organs of the UN have become almost irrelevant. I'm telling you, the reason why is because of who our president of the United States is. What they do doesn't make news anymore. Do you ever hear like the UN did this or the UN did that? No, because it doesn't matter. They couldn't figure out what side to take in Syria. They don't know what to do about, they keep elevating China like other international organizations, even though they have these grave human rights abuses there, where they've got concentration camps for Muslims in China, and yet they're on the Human Rights Council. I mean, it is, again, I think what we're seeing, go back to a headline. This is a headline in an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, in 2017, January 2017, John Kerry. Trump moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem would lead to a Mideast explosion. Do you want to go back to those people being in charge? Because we're going to talk politics second half hour of the broadcast. And I asked you that question. I want you to call in, and if you thought if the election were held today, who do you think would win? Who would carry enough electoral votes to win the election? Because the polls in these states are all within the margin of error, which I think benefits President Trump, because usually he underpolls. And so if he's in the margin of error in places that they didn't even think were in play, like New Hampshire that just came out, where it's like 3-point Biden lead, that's margin of error. Those were not even states that were considered on the map for President Trump. And now the whole map has shifted. It's been shifting since 2015, actually, before he was elected. But if it was held today, where do you believe would happen? I want to get your phone calls on that. Start calling in now, 1-800-684-3110. Jeff Ballabon is going to be joining us in the next segment of the broadcast. He was there yesterday, and he is an ACLJ senior counsel as well on these international issues in government affairs. So he'll be joining us to give his perspective on the events as he saw them yesterday and kind of as it moves along. He's also very involved in politics, but I think it's time today, and as we get into that second half hour of the broadcast, to get into the politics. The president did that ABC town hall last night while Joe Biden is still stumbling through how to work an iPhone. The president is answering real questions from someone who used to work for Hillary Clinton. He could easily say no to George Stephanopoulos. You could easily say no as a Republican, say, no, I'm not going to work for the former press secretary of a Democrat president, in the modern time. I'm not going to do his town hall, or you got to put somebody else. The president's not afraid of that. He's not afraid of talking to Bob Woodward. But Joe Biden hides. We'll take your calls when we come back. Jeff BALLABON is an ACLJ senior counsel for international and government affairs. He's joining us now. He was actually at the White House yesterday, attended the event, this historic occasion with Israel, the Prime Minister Netanyahu there, of course, President Trump, representatives, the top representatives from, you've got, of course, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. Oman was in attendance, so we're hearing that that's a country that could be next on the list. We've heard anywhere from 5 to 9 additional predominantly Muslim countries that will be signing these, not just peace agreements with Israel, but economic agreements, tourist agreements, the flying back and forth. So you've got full diplomatic relations, if you will, not as tense as the relationships with Egypt and even with Jordan. I mean, these are much more, open relationships that are being developed out of these agreements. Jeff BALLABON was there. He's joining us now on the broadcast. And again, I want to get your phone calls in now, 1-800-684-3110, because a new Rasmussen poll just come out, just to tease this for our second half hour, for the first time actually showing President Trump in the lead in a national poll. And Rasmussen's been pretty accurate. It's been the closest one to be able to figure out where they've all underpolled Trump in the past. But they did show that trend coming in the last election in those final few days. We started talking about that on radio almost 4 years ago, that you could start seeing a trend. Now, I want to go to Jeff BALLABON because Jeff was there. Jeff, tell everybody, just kind of explain to everybody what it was like, because I'm sure you had representatives in the United States from the Jewish community, Israeli officials there, but also officials from these other countries that are usually not attending events, maybe at the UN, but certainly not in celebration of one another, from Bahrain and the UAE, what it was like to be in that audience.
Thanks, Jordan. I got to tell you, it was, people use the word historic a lot. This was historic in every sense of the word. You felt it. The atmosphere was just electric. The word that I heard most often was, it's a miracle. It's just miraculous. It was, as you said just now, Jordan, and we've been to Israel together many times, it's not the kind of cold, barely tolerating each other kind of relationship. There's a feeling of a genuine desire to move ahead, to get past the old enmity, to move into a new world. And it's all because of the brand new direction, the bold, tremendously different direction that this president and his team have taken in terms of supporting Israel, not pretending that the problem is Israel, not pretending that the problem is Jews living in Jerusalem, but saying, no, Israel is our ally. Israel wants peace. Stand with Israel and we'll stand with you.
I mean, what I heard from President Trump was so interesting, Jeff, and I think it was so meaningful, was that now Muslim tourists from the UAE and from Bahrain, and it would be open to others, just like there are Jewish religious tourist groups to go, from the United States and all over the world to visit holy sites, Christian groups that go to Israel. Now you've got, because of these diplomatic ties, you'll be able to have religious tourism for these Muslims. They'll be able to visit their holiest sites too in a peaceful way. I think, to me, that was an extremely moving moment, because that's when you really get towards peace, when you have tourists. I think, it's not just about money. It's not just about economics, but it's also about the exchange of people just visiting.
And Jordan, Israel's never been the barrier to that. Israel has always extended as much religious liberty and freedom as they could in a land that is so holy to so many different streams of faiths, not just major faiths. Israel has always kept the door open for people to come and pray And really the problem has been they've been dug into old enmities and old narratives and old stories, and Trump just blew them all away, and he opened up the door. And it was very, very moving. You could see the appreciation. After the official event was over, it was also interesting to watch. There were myself and a number of people who just joined together for impromptu afternoon Jewish religious services on the South Lawn. And a lot of people came over. Christians came over. Muslims, people from the Arab countries came over to ask us the questions, to talk about it. We're filming it. That's really, at the end of the day, what can bring people together is what's been dividing us all along.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Back before really these intifadas were started by the Palestinians, and you would visit Israel, I remember you could visit the Dome of the Rock pretty easily as a tourist. I mean, you go through a checkpoint, but it was not hard, difficult, and it wasn't like a animosity towards it. It was just if you had the respect, you could visit the Dome of the Rock. If you had the respect, you could visit the Western Wall. Of course, these are holy sites, so there's a certain amount of respect you have to have as a tourist. It's just like visiting any other place like that. That hasn't been the case more recently, but I think this will be opening the door to that, because it will not be quite as tense, because the leadership behind who controls really those holy sites is interesting. When you look at, it's really like a Saudi kind of governing council when it comes to the Dome of the Rock. And now you look at the fact that you already have Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, and Bahrain with these ties. It looks like Oman, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Sudan are coming quickly as well, Jeff. That I know we've done a lot with boycott, divestment, and sanctions, Andy, and this is interesting. It was put up by UN Watch, which is a group that opposes, of course, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And Andy, they said, the last two groups, I want Jeff's comments on this as well. The last two main advocates of the Arab boycott of Israel are U.S.-based groups or UK-based groups. It's Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch.
Yeah, that I think is a reprehensible fact, that the people who are advocating this absurd BDS movement are no longer the Arab countries that have been Israel's enemies, but groups that are based in the United Kingdom and in the United States. But I'd like to ask Jeff. Jeff, you were there and you saw and felt the electric, as you described it, atmosphere. Would you say that this historic, and I mean historic, biblically historic event could have taken place without the enzyme being provided and the impetus being provided by President Trump?
There is no question, Andy, that this president's willingness to look past old mythologies and old narratives and ignore what everyone's saying, this is the only way, this is the expertise, and just looking at this with fresh eyes. I mean, he's already delivered. And as Jordan points out, there are many more lining up. More real potential future peace, not just that, but integration, true integration and friendship than we've ever seen before. And it is absolutely Donald Trump. There is no one else. No one else could have done it. No one else has done it. Everyone else talks about peace. He delivered it. And what I find fascinating, it's not surprising to any of us here that Israel would leap at this and would, put up on the old city walls these beautiful images of the flags of the different countries flying together. What's fascinating is that that's never been, reciprocated on the other side, coming up from within. But if you look at social media now, what you see is all these videos coming out of children singing shalom from Arab countries, of just individuals saying, cousins, we've been waiting so long, we want to get together with you. Look, there's no way to know how deep it is, but we've never seen that kind of surge from just regular, decent people saying enough of the fighting, enough of the terror. Why can't we all just get along? And it took Donald Trump to open that door.
I think, again, it was a historic, Jeff, and we know this is not the end. I mean, I think that's what's really cool about this, is that if President Trump is reelected, we're going to be talking about this in the second half hour, but even before that there are more countries. We only got 30 seconds left, but Jeff, there are more countries lining up, countries that, I mean, it would send an even bigger message, because it expands out of the Gulf states even into North Africa.
I agree with you 100%, Jordan, and I think that the work we continue to do with those countries is going to be very important going forward.
Think about this. It's so great to have Jeff BALLABON, ACLJ senior counsel, who was there yesterday at the White House. Think about Sudan. It was the home of Osama bin Laden, and it is now likely one of the next countries to be recognizing Israel this way diplomatically. Second half hour coming up of Jay Sekulow Live.
Thanks to your support of the ACLJ, we have had many victories.
The IRS now formally apologizing to Tea Party groups.
If any group feels like they're being targeted, they can go to federal court and bring our case. That's a victory.
It's one of the most significant wins in the ACLJ's history, to take on the IRS and win.
For more than 27 years, the ACLJ has been fighting for freedom and liberty in the United States and around the globe.
These are young people in their 20s and 30s that are doing this. They're fighting for life at a whole new level to beat back the abortion juggernaut. But I actually think we're winning this. This is one of the social issues we're winning.
The release of Andrew Brunson.
We're flying and they finally left Turkish airspace. It's like, okay, we're really out of Turkey and free again.
We need your help as we continue this work here in the United States and around the world. Join us online at the American Center for Law and Justice at aclj.org.
Live from Washington, D.C., Jay Sekulow Live. And now, your host, Jordan Sekulow.
Welcome back to Jay Sekulow Live. Thanks for joining us for our second half hour of the broadcast. We're going to switch into some politics here because it's important as you talk about the Middle East peace and these different approaches we talked about yesterday with our special advisor, Rick Rinnell. This is someone who's came to Washington to shake up Washington, President Trump, not do things as normal. Of course, he's had to pay for that in a sense, and we've lived that, the special counsel, the impeachment, because he's not doing things as normal. He's saying, you know what, we're not going to go through the Palestinians to reach Bahrain. We're not going to go through the Palestinians to reach the UAE. We're going to go directly to the UAE and say, you know, we have a good relationship with you. Why are you not working with more directly? Why can't you do this in a public way, recognize and have economic ties and tourism at a time when the world needs each other economically through COVID, in a very important time, symbolic time for that as well. And we're starting to see these countries line up. It is President Trump who is bringing peace to the Middle East. It's not exploding. That's what John Kerry said would happen because of where we put our embassy. See, that was the old way of thinking, I think, Andy, in Washington, D.C. Yeah. Where our building was suddenly start a world war. And the truth is, no, it shows we have strength. You're going to have to deal with us this way. And that's what this part of the world, that's what kingdoms that are represented by kings and monarchs, they do. They recognize strength and they respond to strength, not weakness.
This is so true historically, Jordan. This is not only true in the Middle East, but it is particularly true in the Middle East. There is one thing that the Middle Eastern kingdoms and principalities and countries understand, and that is strength and the use of force. And the fact that I remember the image of President Obama going, I think he was meeting the president of Saudi Arabia and bowing before him. Do you think that conveyed a sign of reverence or something on the part of the Saudi king? No, you don't bow like you don't bow. The Queen does not bow her head to anybody. The United States does not bow its head to anybody. We show through strength and force and leadership what we are, and that is a force for good, for peace, and for sanity in the world. And the President of the United States has shown that. There are no nations in the Middle East who do not respect him. Ambassador Grinnell said he charmed Angela Merkel. He is that kind of a person. He has that kind of a personality. And I think he is the enzyme and the catalyst, it's the word that I was looking for, the catalyst behind what we see happening in the Middle East. And I think that that's very, very important. And I think that that is recognized by the vast majority of the American people who don't speak up, who keep their mouths shut, but who on election day are going to show where their sympathies lie.
Listen, I'll tell you, I got my Trump signs yesterday. Last time around, it was a little bit nerve-wracking. This time around, I'm putting the bumper sticker on the car. It's after Labor Day now. The bumper sticker's going on the car. The yard sign's going up. I got neighbors with there are other signs. We live in a free country. No more of this being a free. I think there is a silent majority, but I gotta. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we come back. I gotta play this soundbite though, because you have to remember. Do you want to go back to the guys, as Joe Biden has said, who want to redo and put us back into a deal with the Iranians on our nuclear program? Because this is what John Kerry thought would happen. This is what he predicted. Oh, if Donald Trump does this, this is what we'll see. Here he is on CBS 2017.
Kerry is also concerned about the Middle East, where he spent 9 months trying to secure peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. He said the president-elect's campaign pledge to move the U.S. embassy to the disputed city of Jerusalem would inflame the Arab world.
You'd have an explosion, an absolute explosion in the region.
And there was no explosion in the region. I mean, politically, this is supposed to be a Secretary of State. John Kerry's in Congress a long time, in the U.S. Senate. He's just very similar to Joe Biden in background. Spent all these years in Washington, D.C. It just shows their theories are absolutely wrong. They have been wrong for 48, 50 years, and finally we've changed that. God willing, we're not going to go back to that.
Yeah, whoops, Jordan. I think the only explosion you had in the region was an explosion of peace deals. And by the way, I read the tea leaves here. I absolutely agree. There's several more lining up. John Kerry couldn't have been more wrong on this.
You know, when we come back, we're going to talk straight up politics then. Let's get into it. If the election were held today, who do you think would win? There is this, seems like this huge silent majority, but also this like Trump majority, which isn't just part of the Republican Party. You see him in these boat parades and all these other events. We'll talk about that when we come back.
Hi, I'm Jordan Sekulow. Right now, your kids are stuck at home, trying to learn online, and the ACLJ is here to help. We believe the great and sometimes complicated history of our nation is too important to let anyone overlook. Not because of a pandemic, and certainly not because of someone's political agenda. But there are people out there right now, even political leaders, that have called to abolish history classes. They want to erase American history from classrooms and from textbooks. And that's why now, more than ever, we need to be honest and educate our kids on who founded this country, how government works, and what, even as a kid, they can do to protect it. You see, creating engaging and entertaining content for kids is one of my passions. I've been blessed to work with the biggest players in the industry, including Disney and Nickelodeon. But there's a glaring hole in that space. A channel that shares the same principles that you want to instill in our next generation. That's why we came up with this exciting new project that will offer fun and educational video content that you can share with your children and grandchildren. It's a brand new channel from your friends at the ACLJ. We call it Bald Beagle. Bald Beagle. I know it's fun to say, and yes, our logo is a half bald eagle, half beagle, but it'll be even more fun to watch. Bald Beagle will have your children's interest at heart with great content that at times will feel over the top and ridiculous, but it's actually very serious business. Bald Beagle's initial launch will be on YouTube. We believe our content needs to be available to kids where they are. And if your kids are anything like mine, that's YouTube. George Washington once referred to kids
as the future guardians of the liberties of this country.
Right. And we at the ACLJ and Bald Beagle believe we must provide an option now to raise those future guardians.
I like the sound of that.
Me too. If you believe in this mission and want your kids and grandkids to benefit from an educational entertainment platform that honors the same core values you do, visit baldbeagle.com today.
New Hampshire within the margin of error. Not even a state that was on the map that was being considered in play for the Trump campaign or the Republicans in general. Minnesota within the margin of error, Michigan within the margin of error. I mean, you go through these state by states. If Joe Biden is leading, it is like by 3 points. That's statistically zero. So he doesn't have in any of those battleground states. He has no lead that's insurmountable. Has no, and even I think it was New York Times said no significant leads anywhere, which has got the Democrats very nervous. But they've also been making a lot of mistakes. We're going to start taking your phone calls in a second. So if you want to talk to us on the air, 1-800-684-3110. Where do you think this race is? Because I think talking to all of you is more important than even these polls. But what I know is these polls, they oversample Democrats. They undersample Republicans, even Rasmussen. They in their latest poll, which is showing for the first time Trump leading nationally. Trump has actually got the national poll lead, which is less important than the state polls, I will say, but is still significant. Oversampled Democrats by about 5% in that poll, and also a lot of independents. There's just not as many independents as this poll showed that actually come out and vote. But it still showed Trump in the lead. This is with COVID. This is with, the natural disasters that are happening, but also with peace deals, with an incredible economy, even through COVID, an incredible economic rebound occurring. And I think people are saying, hey, I'd rather keep this on track. I don't want to necessarily go to these old guys who thought that, moving an embassy was going to cause war, when now we're making peace deals that have never been done. And I don't want to go back and make a deal with Iran again and give them $7 billion to come into some deal that we can't even actually check on their nuclear program. But I think it got even a little worse yesterday for the Biden campaign, because what we saw was Kamala Harris. You could say it was a slip of the tongue, but not really, because a slip of the tongue is not saying what she said. I do not give her a pass on this. She's a professional politician, and I think, honestly, she's been at her worst. Kamala Harris was so much more impressive as a senator and a candidate than she has been as the VP nominee. I mean, she just has, I don't know if it's the virtual campaigning, but now she's actually going to some campaigns, events, and it seems like she's just been at her worst. And maybe that's what happens when you associate with people like the Biden campaign, who seem like they just can't figure it out. Take a listen to what she had to say, and then it gets even worse with Joe Biden. But take a listen. This is Kamala Harris on the campaign trail yesterday, Bite 21.
Need to make sure you have a president in the White House who actually sees you, who understands your needs, who understands the dignity of your work, and who has your back. A Harris administration, together with Joe Biden as the president of the United States, the Biden-Harris administration will provide access to $100 billion in low-interest loans and investments for minority business owners.
It doesn't even matter what she said after that, because she stepped on it twice. This Harris administration together with Joe Biden. I mean, she talked about it, Harry, as if, again, Joe Biden is just kind of there. He's like, and that's what we've been talking about. He's just the vessel to get these those who are more on the far left in power, and that he's like a Trojan horse. He's not going to be making any of the decisions. He's just, I mean, he literally is like the guy who reads the teleprompter, and that's about it.
I think you're precisely correct. Kamala Harris is consumed by herself and by progressive and left-wing policies. While the nation is increasingly being torn apart by riots and identity politics that put the lives of police officers in danger, and while the rule of law is being torn apart largely in progressive cities that have been crumbling for decades under leftist leadership, two pertinent questions assume center stage. First, can a nation currently cowering in the face of threats connected to a virus which originated in China recapture sufficient courage to stand up to woke authorities and woke corporations, affluent rioters dressed as ninjas in hub cities, and privileged celebrities who hector us with empty slogans? Second, can the nation heal its searing divisions and recapture a governance framework which the founders envisioned and which worked before? Rather than answer such questions, and rather than face the American people directly, as President Trump has done on countless occasions, and rather than celebrating a new dawn for Middle East peace, and rather than reaching out to police officers who have been ambushed in the line of duty, Joe Biden, as his distinguished effort to advance the Kamala Harris administration, when he's not talking to his own teleprompter, spends copious times doing four things. First, he allows himself to be literally interviewed by the wheat in the wheat fields of Delaware. Second, he attempts to sow division rather than offer specific proposals to heal the nation and put America and working-class Americans ahead of global elites and the Chinese government. Third, he opened his outreach to Latino voters yesterday by playing the Spanish-language song Despacito, grinning and swaying to the beat as he did so. He doesn't seem to understand that Despacito means slowly in Spanish. This means his craven attempt to pander to Spanish-speaking Americans was cringeworthy and suggests that he is indeed Slow Joe. Fourth, Joe Biden prefers to kowtow to the woefully mismanaged World Health Organization and to deny his own record of failing to take COVID-19 seriously. This record includes his criticism of President Trump's decision to close the borders to China. So Joe Biden is not leading a campaign to restore the lives of the American people. Instead, he really wants to shut down the entire economy based on ideologically driven understandings of science and climate change.
Is there anything left to say? I feel like we just clip that. We need to clip Harry today. We need to put that out on social media so that everyone can see that and hear that one more time. Just this walkthrough of the problem with this, what Biden is trying to sell to the American people. And it got worse yesterday because you think, okay, Kamala Harris, she makes the gaffe. I think it's more than a gaffe. I think it's kind of what they actually think, which is we're going to be running things because this guy is like, the only time he can make coherent sentences is when he's deadlocked. Like if you're watching me, he looks like this. It's a little off the camera. It's a little off because he's staring at, he's like holding on like to the thing because he's reading the teleprompter so carefully, not to make gaffes. Because when he does speak, you would think he'd be a little bit more cautious about this because of what happened earlier in the day with Kamala Harris. But no, he hears a gaffe, he doubles down on it. Joe Biden, take a listen, Bite 20.
Harris-Biden administration is going to relaunch that effort and keep pushing further to make it easier for military spouses and veterans to find.
He's putting himself then in second fiddle, and he's the one we're electing. Supposedly, he's on the ballot. He will be on the ballot. He is definitely on the ballot as who to choose for commander-in-chief, not Kamala Harris.
Well, look, I can actually understand how Senator Harris would do this, Jordan. You think about your own name first if you're on the ticket. How in the world can the nominee put his name? There's just no explanation or no excuse, Jordan, for it. And look, I mean, we can get a good chuckle out of it, but I actually think it's damaging for this reason. The biggest knock on Joe Biden from the very beginning was that he was going to be a placeholder, that he was just going to, keep the seat warm. Right. He was only going to run one term. They were going to put someone else up. That was the biggest knock before he ever made the gaffe. So that makes this mistake more problematic than it otherwise would have been. Jordan, if he had a different persona, if you knew he was going to run for re-election, if there wasn't that worry, probably no big deal. But the fact that it speaks to his biggest vulnerability even before he made it, Jordan, I actually think it makes it a big deal.
And I don't think that vice presidential nominees get vetted as much by the American people. That's not who they choose usually on how to vote. They play very significant roles. I'm not playing that down, the office of vice president. But it's the person on the top of the ticket that gets the people out to vote. And so Kamala Harris should be a lot more vetted, but she won't be. If she's really going to be the one running things, she shouldn't just have to do one debate with Mike Pence. She should have to do 3 debates with Donald Trump. Imagine that. I don't think she'd be standing afterwards because of her record. I don't think she's ready for that prime time. In fact, Democrats said in their own primary she's not ready for that prime time spot to be commander-in-chief. Yet, by choosing Joe Biden, they said, but we do like, politically where she is, and Joe Biden will just go along with it. I mean, just listen again. He said it, Bite 20.
Harris-Biden administration is going to relaunch that effort and keep pushing
Biden
forward.
administration. When we come back, we start taking your phone calls at 1-800-684-3110. This is why I think even with COVID and the blame they try to put on President Trump, and he's supposed to be divisive, and he's supposed to be the cause of all of the divisiveness and the protests, and he's the reason why, and he's the problem. He caused the wildfires, not bad forest management where they won't burn brush. But President Trump, he caused a wildfire. He causes hurricanes. But yet he's not responsible for the economic recoveries. He's not responsible for the economic booms. He's not responsible for Middle East peace. So they can't have that both ways. Their problem. And their message is just not coherent. I mean, did anybody care 2 days ago when Joe Biden's talking about climate change, when you're dealing with the issues we're all facing as individuals right now, whether you got kids in school or trying to figure out school or figuring out your business, wouldn't you rather have a business person leading whose head is in the right place than a guy who's talking about taxing you more for climate issues? Think about that. We'll take your calls when we come back on Jay Sekulow Live.
Thanks to your support of the ACLJ, we have had many victories.
The IRS now formally apologizing to Tea Party groups.
The IRS did the right thing by resolving the case with an injunction that mandated a complete change of the IRS nonprofit tax-exempt work as it relates to issue advocacy organization.
If any group feels like they're being targeted, they can go to federal court and bring our case. That's a victory.
It's one of the most significant wins in the ACLJ's history, to take on the IRS and win.
For more than 27 years, the ACLJ has been fighting for freedom and liberty in the United States and around the globe.
These are young people in their 20s and 30s that are doing this. They're fighting for life at a whole new level to beat back the abortion juggernaut. We've got a whole group of young lawyers that are defending them.
Those of us that believe in life know that we're on the right side of history. We understand full well children are children, and they're precious in God's sight, and they're precious in our nation's sight, and they're precious to parents.
But I actually think we're winning this. This is one of the social issues we're winning.
The release of Andrew Brunson. He is the American evangelical from North Carolina, held in Turkey for more than 2 years.
They're rushing us to the airport, and there was an Air Force plane that came from Germany that had been on standby. We're flying, and they finally left Turkish airspace. It's like, okay, now we're really out of Turkey and free again.
We're grateful to ACLJ who put it out to these people, they were getting all this out.
All of the people who prayed for us through ACLJ and through your contacts, I'm thankful, I'm grateful, and actually I'm astounded.
We need your help as we continue this work here in the United States and around the world. Join us online at the American Center for Law and Justice at aclj.org.
All right, we said we're going to go right to the phone calls, and that is what we're going to do. And let's make sure we get Judy one of our books signed as well, maybe the next Red Wave. Judy is calling from Oregon on line 3. Judy, first let me just ask you, how are you doing with those wildfires? I know that I've got family and my wife's family that is from Oregon and also from L.A. on the West Coast, but she's got family in Oregon. I've seen their photos. It's pretty horrific to see, even just they're not necessarily near the fires, but just the smoke and how it's affected the environment. So how are you doing?
Well, we haven't seen the sun probably for a week. And I live just, about 7 miles from Bald Peak. That fire's contained, but still it's smoky. It's nasty. Some of them are contained. We have friends that are not in their home yet. Some of them have no home. It's nasty. I'll just say that. And we appreciate prayer for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. People be in prayer for that. And I mean, I guess this would be the second question I'd have for you too is, do people really think that it's the president's fault? I mean, that I don't care who the president is, but that it's the president's fault for these like wildfires, and some that have been started by people, others that, could be, we call them kind of like in the legal world, acts of God that are outside the control of man.
Well, I mean, there is talk of that, but I can tell you that we just got back from vacation. So any people that I know here in Oregon no. Why would any president, I don't care who the president is, why would they ever think that was his fault because of a wildfire or anything else? It's not. It's just not. Yeah. And we don't hear a lot of that. Of course, that doesn't mean it isn't out there either.
Sure. Obviously, we know it's out there by the mainstream media, by Joe Biden is telling people, it's the president starting these fires, and it's the reason why you're facing what you're facing. But you also bring up, and I think it's important too, that, in places like Oregon, and I think this was kind of nationwide last time. It was pretty extreme if you had put a Trump sticker on your car. And it's gotten more and more extreme to put up any kind of political messages on your vehicle or outside your house. It used to not be that big of a deal. So, maybe in some places, or you talk about still that there is that silent majority. Whether or not it's going to carry Oregon or not for the president is not necessarily the case. But in a lot of states across the country where people are they're not going to advertise it necessarily by wearing the T-shirt or a MAGA hat around or putting the sign in their yard. Though some of us have changed, I will tell you, I've changed my mind on that too. It's good to be more public about it, but there is still that silent majority as well.
Well, I can tell you that we have a sign, we have a sticker. Is it on our car? Is it in our yard? No, because we've got people coming out here from Portland, and I don't need to say who I think they are. But, they'll come and burn it. They'll take it. It's a fear of what they'll do to your home, to your vehicle. That's how it is here. But yet, if you do go out into the rural areas, there will be a Trump flag, and it'll be where you can't get it. It'll be on their property, on the top of a sign, and they'll be well protected. They've got protected property. I'll just tell you that.
Yeah, right. I kind of feel like same position. I live in a neighborhood mostly where most of the signs are candidates on the left, and I've got a Republican Senate candidate sign in my yard that I've had for 2 months. I haven't had issues with that yet, and it says in very small print that he was endorsed by Trump. And that was Bill Haggard, who's been on this broadcast before, and he's now the nominee. He's gone through the primary. It's not that controversial, though, where I live, because it's not much of it. It's not a very it's a pretty red state still, we'll put it that way. That being said, in my neighborhood, I will probably be – now, I just got the sign. I'll get the sign the holder Friday. It might be the only one I see until I cross over the road to the other neighborhood where there's a few more, but like the only one within a few blocks of our house. So I get how you're feeling, Judy, too. And it's not just in your state. It's also like where you live in a state. You can live in a red state, but in a liberal area or in an area that's got, more college professors and people like that living in it and drive down the road. I think that it's still significant, but also I kind of want to say this to the group, and then I want to get to Rose's call. It's been in the news as well, though. There is the silent group. Like she was talking about, she's got the sign, she's got the bumper sticker, but it's not actually on their car. It's not actually in front of their house. But there is also this group that is this unknown, I think is why they don't poll, they are about Trump. And Trump has become an identity as well, and a brand, which is what he was before. It's not surprising. That's why we see these boat events happening on lakes. We see the merchandising, even that's not official merchandising, and it has become a brand and a lifestyle. So there's a silent majority, but there's also, I think, what the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, what they call it, is a screaming out majority as well.
It is, Jordan. There is this silent majority was something that we heard in the Nixon administration, in the Nixon years. And as I recall, I was a young child, of course, at that time. But I recall that they said, watch out for the silent majority coming out. And that's what it is. Those of us who are for the president and who are for his ideals, for the absence of government in our lives, for good foreign relations between Israel and the Arab countries who have done the things that he advocates and have advocated for him as well, do not tend to advertise who we stand for. And a lot of it is simply because we don't want anyone to know. There's a fear and an apprehension in many ways on our part as to what the retaliation may be. So we don't say anything. But let me tell you, when we go in that voting booth and it's just me and that computer or that voting sign, I know what I'm going to do. And the people who are around me in my neighborhood, I live in Atlanta, Georgia, in a very liberal neighborhood near Emory University, but I know that Georgia is a red state, and some of these polls that I see talking about Georgia being in play and all that, that's nonsense. That's not the case. Georgia is not Atlanta, and Atlanta is not Georgia.
Yep.
And I think a lot of us feel that way with respect to the president.
It's interesting because, Harry, you came out of the academic world too. I feel like, again, a lot of pressure there that you wouldn't put you could put easily outside on your at your office, whether you're at law school, some Biden sign right now or some other kind of protest sign that was anti-Trump. But if you put something pro-Trump, you may be brought up on review as if you're promoting some kind of hate speech or something. I mean, who knows? The students would come after you, or the school may come after you. So it's very real that there is that group that just feels like they can't speak out about it. But like Andy said, when they didn't actually vote, they're going to vote for President Trump.
I think that's precisely correct. So we live in an era where a cancel culture reigns. And saying anything that is considered to be offensive draws criticism. At Baylor University, an allegedly conservative Baptist school, the university placed a warning label on pictures of Republican students who were showing flags in support of the 9/11 memorial. Imagine that. 3,000 Americans died, and at Baylor University, they are now woke. And so I think President Trump, if you look at the polls, first, there's underpolling of Republicans. Second, Trump supporters are refusing to answer pollsters' questions. And third, the surging level of division in the United States works in favor of the president.
I want to take Rose's call, final call of the day in Connecticut. Rose on line 4. Welcome to Jay Sekulow Live. Thanks for holding on. And Rose, I think you're going to be talking about a red wave. I want to make sure we send you a copy of my book, The Next Red Wave, which I tell you, you have to write these books out in advance. There have been time periods, Rose, where I felt like, maybe my predictions weren't right. Maybe we had overdone it. But you know what, Rose? I'm starting to feel a little bit differently right now. What about you?
Oh, I feel differently, too. I'm a proud member of the silent majority. I live in a deeply blue state.
Yep.
Last year, I was at a carnival before all this hit, and there were lots of stands selling Trump paraphernalia in Connecticut.
In Connecticut.
I bought myself a hat. I wore it around. A bunch of ladies with hats on grabbed me, wanted a picture, go, yay, we're Trump supporters.
Yeah, they're everywhere in every walk of life, from universities to country clubs to